Hi, I'm Erika of Grapefruit and Gardenia Designs and the Knit Kind podcast. I am coming at you today from an almost finished construction zone, I hope, in my home. I have been podcasting from Martha's Vineyard, and as you saw in my last one, if you caught the September updates, I am back to reality, back to school, back to all the things that are fall in New England here in the suburbs of Boston. And this weekend, I'm recording this on Friday the 13th, and this weekend there is going to be the launch of two patterns that I have been talking about for a long time but not done a full episode on. And so I'm excited to record that for you today and share more in a conversation, really. I don't want this to be something that feels very rehearsed, although I think in my brain I have been going over and over for quite a while the things that I do want to share about these very special patterns. So it's entirely possible I'm going to have more to say in the future and that I won't get through all of it today, but it's an exciting time. I invite you, if you like this episode, to like the video, to subscribe, and to help us reach more people, and particularly knitters who are passionate about farm yarn, sustainability, small batch yarn, all of these things that are so important to me and to the fiber community and to our world, our community at large. So where I'm starting today is what I'm wearing. It's the Shearing Day shawl, and it was one of two designs, or is one of two designs, that I have done with Shorn 5, which is a small batch curated yarn by Melissa Littlefield of Knitting the Stash. This is, as it says in the name, the 5th iteration of her doing this small batch yarn, and she recently announced it's the last. So I didn't know that going into the design, just as I didn't know some other things, and I feel like it really is all kind of fated and meant to be, that this story and the stories I'm going to tell you through these designs about shepherds, that they just tie so nicely together with the fact that this is the final time she's going to be producing this specific yarn. And yet it's important to both of us that people continue to seek out, whether it's small batch yarn or farm to skein, local to you, ethically sourced, and so on and so forth. These patterns have a life far beyond the kits that she is going to have available publicly on Sunday, September 15th. So if you miss that opportunity to have a kit, please don't feel like this isn't the pattern for you, or that you can't knit in a yarn that carries just as much meaning as the Shorn 5 does for her. So just a little bit about this design first, and then I'm going to get heavily into the other one and maybe come back to this at the end. This is a triangle shawl. I have it over my shoulder so I can easily move it with the microphone, but I wear it front, back, and sideways, which you'll see in the pictures if you look at the pictures in my project page and on the pattern page on Ravelry. It is a classic triangle shawl, and the way that it's written, you can end it sooner or later depending on how much yarn and yardage you have, depending on the size that you'd like to knit. It's not prescriptive that it's all or nothing. It is done in 3 colors. Of course, that's also up to you. There are sections where 3 colors play well together, and then many sections that are just 2 colors and some that are just 1. So that's also the type of thing that you can really feel like you can play around with a color changing yarn. Not necessarily a variegated yarn for sections like the cables, but you know, it's all personal preference. And if you love it, that's really all that matters. So the Shorn 5 is a 3-ply yarn, and it is a DK weight. I would say DK on the lighter side, probably. In my opinion, it's 250 yards per skein, and the skeins are right around, give or take, 100 grams. So it does start with a garter tab cast on, and all of the color work in this shawl is mosaic or slip stitch color work, meaning you're not doing stranded color work, you're not carrying yarn as you go. There are increases along the central spine and increases along the edge. And so the way that this came together, there were a few things that I wanted to highlight with this. One, being a 3-ply yarn, and Melissa also being, as far as I can tell from watching her podcast and the project she chooses, also really loves cables. So I was really trying hard to authentically insert some cables into this design. And you can see here with the light just how beautifully these pop. They are 1x1 crosses. Some people will say they're cables, some people will say they're crosses. You don't even need a cable needle to do these. You can use one if it's easier for you or preferable, but you don't need one, and it will tell you in the pattern how to do them without a cable needle, and you still get that effect. I thought they were really beautiful. I did swatch them in both this oatmeal color as well as the natural color, and I went with the natural because I loved how it popped in the light. So these 3 natural colors, the one in the middle is a blend, and then the light and the dark, I believe, are not blended. They are just the color of the fleece. And also, as I designed this and was honoring sheep and shepherds, I think sometimes you have things that go on subconsciously. So this is a new stitch pattern that I chose and had not used in a pattern before. It did come from a Barbara Walker stitch dictionary. And if you've watched the reel of these patterns that I worked on that I put out on Instagram this week, you'll actually see where I'm kind of comparing different stitch patterns and kind of holding them up, both on my own swatches as well as from the book. And what ended up happening with this one, I loved it because of the way it highlighted the 3 colors, but as you'll see in the other shawl, there's a major focus on sheep and flocks. And if you look closely, do you start to see a flock of sheep staring back at you? Because I did while I was knitting this. It's almost like they're all in a line here with their little feet down here and their little black faces and then their little white bodies around. And so I just found that charming in a way that I hadn't consciously picked it out, but I'm pretty sure subconsciously it must have been there, and then that's all I could see as I kept going. So the motifs more or less repeat. Like I said, it's a garter tab cast on, and then you have a section of mosaic or slip stitch color work here, which is also from a Barbara Walker book, but a little bit modified. I tend to make a few decisions, sometimes based on exact placement or how I like it. And then the pattern I just mentioned, it repeats here, swapping out the contrast color. If you look closely, it goes from having the oatmeal there to having the white. The section of cable crosses, a couple garter bands in between to give you a little rest, and goes on. And the other piece I want to highlight with this one is this bind off. This was a new to me bind off. It mimics, in some ways, I feel like it mimics an I-cord bind off. I know it's different. I'm not implying that it's the same thing, but it sort of gives you that same effect. It is called the double chain bind off. And one of the things about it that I mentioned in the pattern is that when you're first knitting it, it can look like it's going to roll. And there are tips in the pattern for hopefully making sure it doesn't roll for you, at least after it's blocked. Probably for everyone it's going to roll before it's blocked, but I find that it lies really nicely with a nice drape. And so this is Shearing Day Shawl. Melissa will have kits on her website, and it is 1 skein of each of the 3 colors. If you know, now I did mine with 1 skein of each, and I really pushed it to the end, to the limit. I was, have a note about weighing line by line and why this last section I cut off in comparison to the depth of the other sections. If you want a huge shawl, go get more yarn and keep going. You're basically just repeating the same sections, and it should be both intuitive as well as work with the charts that are there as you add sections. Beautiful yarns that are very comparable but do have less yardage, what you'll do is you'll just bind off here and you won't have this little last section of mosaic. Or you can even bind off here. It's very flexible in terms of the pattern. So don't be afraid that you can't use that as long as you're flexible yourself with the final size. Okay, now I'm gonna jump into the one that is a longer story and a deeper story. And it is called Unbroken Circle. And this is a cowl, obviously. It's a Mobius cowl. And this is done with just 2 colors of the Shorn 5, or an alternative farm yarn or not farm yarn that you're working in. I do recommend high contrast if you want this look. If you like the look of a low contrast, it's your knitting, it's your final piece that you want to love and wear or gift, and you can use whatever colors you want, obviously. I did have one test knitter use Junction Fiber Mills making tracks, and my suggestion when choosing those was to choose one with less barber pulling, with less or fewer colors in it, that have like a quicker change, and more that have a more gradual change. The beautiful natural colors, which it was really designed with in mind. So again, this one, you're gonna use, my sample used 92 grams each of each color out of 100 gram skeins that had 250 yards per skein. So keep that in mind as you're selecting your yarn if you're not using a kit from Melissa. Now, the Unbroken Circle cowl, it has a story to it that is probably, well, not probably, it is definitely the most like deepest artistic expression that I've put into one of my designs. And I've talked about this a little bit more when I talk about why design. There are a lot of them that tie back to nature and places I've loved and things that I've loved. Well, this one, and also to stories, and this one honors a story of sheep and shepherds, and specifically one sheep and one shepherd, but really beyond that as well. So where did this start? This started with me waking up on a Tuesday morning, as I often do, getting my coffee and putting on the Junction Fiber Mill Millcast. And there are all different topics, right? Sometimes it's new releases of yarn, sometimes it's a story about a custom processing job. This was so much deeper than that even. Paula Ahrens of Dancing Pony Sheep Farm in New Hampshire had told Peg a story about this relationship she had with a special ewe named Ellie Mae. And she told her this story when they were both vending at the New England Sheep and Wool Festival in Western Massachusetts. And Peg said, I think this story needs to be told more broadly, and would you be willing to come on the Millcast and tell it? And it's such a deeply personal story that I thought it was incredibly gracious of Paula to do this, to be vulnerable, to share the story. And so here's the story. First of all, if you want, push pause now, go over and actually watch Paula tell it in episode 71 of Junction Fiber Mills Millcast, because I'm not even going to attempt to do it justice in terms of being told in the first person, but I will attempt to give you enough references to it as someone who heard it and was deeply affected by it in a really positive, emotional way, even though I'm sure at the time I was bawling, right? So anyhow, you're getting a little sense of where we're going. Paula had a career. She had a career that involved dance and decided, as some of the other people who are featured on the Millcast and Peg herself did, decided to go get a sheep farm. And she did this in New Hampshire without a ton of experience and was learning as she went. So as we've later learned, she wanted Jacob sheep and also got this one Romney named Ellie Mae, because Ellie Mae chose her. We all of us who are animal lovers can relate to this, right? Sometimes the animal chooses you. The bumper stickers that said, you know, who saved who or who saved whom, or all of this, right? And I have gotten most of my pets throughout my life from animal shelters as well. She didn't get hers from an animal shelter. These are sheep. Okay, I'm digressing. But she went to get Jacob's sheep, and there was one Romney that came up and had chosen her to be the person that was going to take care of her for the rest of her life. So Paula's on her farm, and she's going through lambing for the first time. And there was a relationship between Ellie Mae and Romulus, I believe it was. And they didn't think that Ellie Mae had gotten pregnant that year. Well, she did, just later than other ewes. And so the birthing process was later, or the lambing process was later in the season. It didn't happen in as controlled of an environment as normally it would. It was out in the field. And there is an incredibly sad but very real story about how lambing can go wrong, unfortunately, in some of the worst ways. And Ellie Mae was able to deliver the lamb, but the lamb did not survive. Ellie Mae's life was saved between Paula's care and veterinary care. And what Paula witnessed is something that was even more empathetic than humans are usually able to do with each other in the face of grief and loss. Sometimes I think because logic and emotions and the way we're supposed to act gets in the way of just a very visceral reaction, or going back to like the core of nature and who we would be to each other as a community. And so what Paula witnessed was Ellie Mae going from calling for her lamb to bawling for her lamb and realizing that her lamb was not coming. And so she watched the father come and do this gesture with Ellie Mae where he came on the side of her and helped to comfort her. And then he moved on, and every other ewe in the flock that was close to her came to her, did this gesture of comfort, and then they surrounded her in a circle. And they held that circle around Ellie Mae until she entered the next stage of grief. She bawled and bawled and bawled, and they held the circle for her. And then when she stopped bawling, they still held the circle, but they turned outward instead of turning inward. And then when she was finally at the point where she was ready to move on, she broke the circle. And then they dispersed. And that was, probably a very expedited series of steps of grief. And she saw and couldn't believe what she had witnessed. I think, in fact, she may have even said she wasn't sure if people would believe what she had witnessed, right? Because it was so remarkable. So I heard this story and wow, was affected by it. Well, it gets even deeper. So Paula says, fast forward a couple of years, and what she's going through with her mother is that her mother is at the end stage of life. I believe she was across the country, and Paula had gotten a phone call, and the phone call was saying, mom's not gone, but she's on morphine and the end is near. And Paula, I think I'm getting choked up trying to retell the story. Paula went out to the field, took a bucket, tipped it over, sat on the bucket, head in hands, and started her grieving process of crying. Well, Ellie Mae came up to her just as the father of Ellie Mae's lamb had gone up to Ellie Mae and started to comfort her. And then they all came one by one and they surrounded Paula. Okay, this is not my story, but if you're with me, sometimes this is what happens to middle-aged women, right? We get a little more emotional than maybe we did in our 20s. So Paula was surrounded by the sheep, what I'm calling a sheep circle. There may be a term for it, and if there is, please let me know, but she was surrounded by the sheep who held the circle around her until, like Ellie Mae years before, she got up and broke the circle. And so hearing this story and thinking about the way people interact with each other and pets and animals, and the fact that I'm a fiber artist who already loves farm to fiber yarn, this was something that when I watched this, I knew, wow, she's shared her story with the world. And is there a way that I, as a designer, could honor that in a design that's actually made with farm yarn? And I kind of put that in the back of my head and was thinking, I'll go see Paula at a fiber festival and maybe we'll chat about the idea and maybe I can use some of her yarn for it and so on. And really shortly thereafter, this story was early spring, I think, that I first heard it, or late winter. Melissa Littlefield of Knitting the Stash, who, if you don't know, check out her podcast for 2 reasons. One is it's just really informative if you're a knitter or even a designer or an aspiring designer, to see how someone is knitting patterns and modifying patterns and explaining them. And she also has a series of courses. The other thing she does is she highlights farm to skein yarn. There's not a lot of places, if you aren't going to fiber festivals or you don't have farms accessible to you, that you can go that has a marketplace for farm to skein fiber. And Melissa also, in addition to her podcast, Knitting the Stash, she started an online yarn store called Flock that features farm to skein yarn. Many of it in small batches, not all of it, some of it conservation breeds. So there's just a wealth of information there that you can learn. So I was watching her podcast and she put out a call for designers for Shorn 5. And I thought, maybe this is the time I think about bringing that design about Paula and her story and Ellie Mae to life through a farm yarn that's small batch with another person who really cares this much about this type of yarn, and do it in a way that we can all kind of triangulate, if you will, and all help lift each other up, right? And so I answered the call and I explained my concept kind of briefly. I don't know how it sounded. I had never met Melissa before, and I had only really started watching the podcast not too soon before I heard that. And she liked the concept, and I'll show you a little bit of how it developed, because she didn't have the yarn yet, and I, at the time, had a lot of competing priorities, and I thought, oh, can I do this on the right timeline, and how am I going to work it out? And so I went and I bought some Brooklyn tweed yarn, Shelter, and I bought it in 3 colors that I knew weren't going to be exactly the Shorn colors. I have more of a, just see through the bag, a black, gray, and white here. And I just started trying to work out the concept of what does it look like for me to put sheep circles on a design. And I knew, which I'll get into in a second, that I wanted it to be a Mobius cowl. That's important. So I have my provisional cast on down here. And I started with this. And if you watch Melissa's podcast, or if you've already watched it, you'll see that my comment, which I can't get out of my head now, is, yeah, this was really more Space Invaders than Sheep Circle. But it also had the start of something for me. And then I was looking and I said, I'm gonna need some kind of geometric band around it. And this played well with this design, but it wasn't a sheep circle to me. It was a Space Invader. So I went back to my software and my colored pencils, and I said, it's gotta be more circular, right? I said, it's gotta be more like a circle. And I went here. And I liked it. But I thought chocolate chip cookie. Okay, so I couldn't get that out of my head. I went from Space Invaders to chocolate chip cookies. And what I liked here is that I had this idea that there's a middle and things surrounding it, but it was flat. It didn't quite have the textural interest that I wanted it to have. And as this was happening, Melissa was doing a little pre-washing and pre-skeining of some yarns for me to actually pivot and try the Shorn 5. And I think I'm really glad that I worked these out first and knew where I wanted to go. And by the time I got the Shorn 5, I had drafted out this circle, which is what I ended up using. And so what you see here, and I knew it was going to work in the exact same yarn, which is great. What you see here is that I've got this circle and it's got pearls and knit stitches in it. And so it creates texture that ended up having more than one meaning. Where I started was, I wanted the idea of the sheep circle. So multiple sheep surrounding a person or an animal in distress. And so that's why I started with the texture. Well, as you're gonna see, the more I knitted it, all of a sudden I saw individual sheep here as well, because the texture became their fleece. and the center became their face. So as I was looking at that, I knew I wanted the geometric bands in between, and I wanted them to be both aesthetic as well as, I don't want to say symbolic exactly, but none of this was meant to look like intarsia that was trying to capture the actual picture. It was all meant to be really a reference to it, or like I said, symbolic of it. And so the idea of this here, in addition to just being a pretty pattern, is that idea that the sheep would move in on the person or animal in distress. So this was kind of them coming together. And then I liked the idea of, traveling stitches and one color over the other. I actually was playing around with trying to put the middle stitch somehow, but in the end, sometimes you can overthink something, and sometimes I feel like simpler is better. So I swatched this, I got my gauge, I made a plan. So I moved into the cowl and now putting the concept really fully on the needles. And there are some decisions made that were very practical, and some that were aesthetic, and some that kind of resolve the two together. So here, one that was practical is I did my original cast on in this dark color here. And when I came around and was going to graft the provisional cast on, it's just done in one round of the darker color. But this is where we started, went down, and as you can see, my sheep here, they kind of stagger. So they're not directly lined up one over at the other either. And I mentioned the Mobius cowl. So I talk about how in Paula's story, you didn't break, the sheep didn't break their circle. The person or animal in distress in the middle of the circle is the one who chose when it would be broken. And so that's part of, obviously really the whole reason that I call it Unbroken Circle. And it also, if you know the song Unbroken Circle, Will the Circle Be Unbroken? It's one of the things that I was thinking about. There's a performance that's by, I think, Judy Collins, Arlo Guthrie, Tom Rush. I think there's one other person. It will come to me. But you can get it on YouTube, and if it's appropriate, I think I'll link it. I don't think I can play it just for copyright reasons. But it's a song that regardless of your feelings about formal religion, you can translate it to the idea of generational passing and connections and communities. And so, will the circle be unbroken? That is the question. And the story from Paula and the cowl is, it is, yes, it's an unbroken circle in this case. And so what happens is you cast on with your provisional cast on, and you're knitting a tube. So you have multiple illusions here, and I have a kitty who's trying to jump up. Get down, she wants her lunch. So you cast on, now you're knitting in the round. So there's one reference to an unbroken circle, because as you knit, you're stacking circle upon circle upon circle, like that idea of the slinky, right? You're not putting, so you're spiraling as opposed to stacking. So this is an unbroken circle in the way that you knit. When you get to the end and you graft it together, you now truly have an unbroken circle where the inside is the outside and the outside is the inside. And there is this duality here that there are times in your life you're going to be on the inside of the circle and times you're going to be on the outside of the circle. And that sort of goes back to the treat others as you would want to be treated, right? Comfort others. There's times you're going to be in need and times you're going to be doing supporting. And if we could all go back to that, that ties into my Knit Kind podcast, right? We so easily get divided, but how we are much more connected and stronger when we support each other. And then this is where it became both practical and design. So halfway through, I swapped the colors. So again, this goes to a duality. right? You are sometimes one, sometimes the other. Which I love from an artistic perspective. And then from a practical perspective, you're now making this cowl in 2 skeins of yarn and using nearly every last bit. And so if you prefer it all in one color, go for it. But this has 2 meanings to it. And so there it is. And you can wear it in different ways. You can wear it with one color all forward. You can wear it with one color all back. You can wear it half and half, whatever you like. And then at the end, like I said, near where you graft, this is where what I wanted to come up with was, it's the same thing. You've got one in the middle or the other in the middle and the other surrounding it. So it ties back to that story and that reference. And it's even like a little bit of almost like a yin and a yang to it, which is not at all what I was designing in terms of the actual picture, like I say, but it's this balance in nature. Oh, I know what I didn't mention here, right, is the individual sheep. So now you've also got your individual dark sheep with their white faces and the white sheep with their dark faces. And of course, those circle all the way around, right? So it's all metaphor. And what I love is when I knit, I'm a process and a product knitter. And I think I always have been. And I love how, depending again on how you feel about this, like I feel like we obviously put love into stitches, but I feel like we also put energy into stitches. And so I thought that this would make a really beautiful gift, especially if you are gifting it to someone who you can tell this story to. And it's an ode to farm yarn. It's a love letter to farmers and shepherds and the sheep and everything that goes into making yarn, that when I certainly first learned to knit, I was really pretty removed from it. It was in line with my values. It was something that was a natural progression for me to get to, but it is not at all something that when I picked up 2 needles because I wanted to make things my grandmother had made, like intarsia sweaters and Christmas stockings. That was not where I was. And now it's really where I feel very deeply committed to, even though of course it's not the only thing that I'm going to do. So hopefully that gives you a real sense of this pattern, the inspiration for it. I will put it on really briefly, but you can look at the pictures and see how it fits. It's really easily modifiable. If you're either working in a different yarn or you want to make it a different size, you can simply do fewer repeats around. You can make it longer or shorter. You do a little bit of pattern math and you'll be there. And if you can hear me in my microphone, this is how this one fits. So it's a great size. I love it for, it's pretty dense fabric in this particular version. You can do it however you want, but the gauge on this one is tighter, and so it can be used for like outdoor wear to put under a jacket, and then in the winter, I probably will wear it around my neck all winter because my neck gets cold. So another thing I do want to mention is that you might be asking yourself, was everybody okay with Erika doing this design, right? I don't want in any way for it to feel like an exploitation or taking advantage of someone's story. So when I had this idea and had then connected with Melissa about it being done in her shorn yarn, my next steps, once she liked the idea, was to reach out to Paula and to reach out to Peg and Amanda, because it was through the Millcast that I had heard about it, and it's Paula's story. And so everyone was very supportive of this project happening, and that's the only way that I would have pursued it this way, was that if everyone felt like it was the idea that a rising tide lifts all ships, and we're elevating Paula's story as well as all of the shepherds who put so much work into these yarns for us. We're elevating small businesses and women-owned businesses and all of the responsibility, both social and environmental, that go into producing farm yarn. Other thing about honoring Paula's story is that I'm going to show you before we go. I hesitate to show this a little bit because I kind of wanted Paula to see it in person first, but I'm going to be giving this to Paula at Vermont Sheep and Wool, and this is a version that I did in Ellie Mae's last clip, because I think I didn't mention, I know many of you know this story already, but Ellie Mae passed away this summer. And she passed away just the same week that Paula and I had been finalizing the details of having a sample knit. And then there was just no question that I was going to knit it for Paula. And so the cream here is Ellie Mae. And I'm pretty positive that this was spun by Junction Fiber Mill to tie it back together again. And the green here, which is just a beautiful earthy green, is Romney Ensemble, which is also from Dancing Pony Sheep Farm. So I will talk more after the launch with Melissa of the kits and Shorn 5. I will talk more about ways that if you are now looking, there's not Shorn 5 anymore, or it's not accessible to you for some reason, or you have stuff in your stash that you want to use, I'll do a little recording with some ways that you can look at a different gauge, because you might notice a couple things about this. It looks obviously very similar, but it is a different gauge. It is a different number of repeats around, and it is a different number of repeats for the length. So this is more of a worsted weight yarn. It still has all the details. It has a slightly less, I did more with the green background than the white. I could have done equal amounts and it would have been very long. I could have done shorter amounts, it would have been a little shorter. So I kind of compromised in the middle, and then it still has this here. So this is really special to me. I can't wait to give it to Paula, and I hope that it's something that she's able to have that's not only a sample for her, but that really is something special for her to have. So fascinating. And what you're going to see, if you've watched my last couple of podcasts, you'll know that I've designed a sweater that was inspired by hydrangeas, and that Ellie Mae's name before she became Ellie Mae was hydrangea. And I just think it's such an interesting connection that making this cowl and this texture and this shape fed right into that hydrangea sweater, unbeknownst to me at the time that Ellie Mae's name was hydrangea before. So I feel like these patterns, these designs have been really special to me. I hope that you find them interesting, inspiring, touching, like something that maybe transcends somehow just knitting something for someone, just product knitting. I hope that maybe this, if you are a product knitter, it gets you more in touch with the process as well. If you've never knitted with farm yarns, maybe this is a way to introduce yourself to farm yarns. And I have a few episodes that might tell you some that you might prefer better than others if you're just getting started. These, I can tell you, are both, for me, these are both next to skin soft. I wouldn't have any trouble. So Melissa's Shorn 5 is mostly Corriedale, and this is Romney. And there's a big range with Romney. You can't just look at it and say that there's a breed and everything that breed is going to feel the same, because a lot will have to do with the fleece quality and the care and the production of the yarn. So I hope you enjoy. Knit kindly, live kindly, and I will see you again soon.